Welcome to the BLTnT Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Loria, serving up real stories of business, life, technology, and transformations. You'll hear from interesting people about big changes from career shifts to life-altering decisions and the innovations that help make it all happen. It's about sharing those light bulb moments, pivot points, challenges overcome, and the journeys that inspire us to think differently. If you're on the lookout for insights to propel you forward, stories that resonate, or just a bit of inspiration on your next BLTnT move, you're in the right place. Let's dig in. All right, welcome to this episode of the BLTnT Podcast. I'm sitting here with my friend York Moore, and I'd like to tell you that he's going to kick off this this summer with a series that we've got that we're calling the Summer of AI.
Intriguing.
So, yeah, and with his topic of the AI and the mind of God, you're going to be pretty impressed on where we're going to start this and give you a vision into what we think is going on with AI, what it could mean for the world, and get your thoughts on it. So thanks for being a part of the kickoff episode.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
York is the CEO of the CCO, the Coalition of Christian Outreach, and he's also well known as the founder of the Every Campus movement. And he's going to explain to us what that is at various points throughout this this episode. But you're going to give us a really interesting life story that has elements of homelessness to data science to being the CEO of a multi-million-dollar organization.
That's right.
And a professional speaker and an author and a dad and a farmer and a armchair psychologist like myself and a fellow germaphobe.
Yeah.
So we got it all going on today.
We got it all going on.
So, yeah. So, I would describe you to my other friends as a fashion-forward man.
Okay, I'll take it.
Always good looking.
I'll take it.
So, and you were just telling me that you make that shirt look even better than what it looks like.
I try anything for you, man.
You keep it up. The other thing that we're going to talk about today is one of your talks that I can't wait to hear the summary of. And I actually purposefully did not look it up, purposely did not ask you any more questions of it, is the AI and the mind of God discussion that you've given. So we've got a lot to unpack here, the various layers of the onion called York Moore, and a good smelling onion too. He does not smell like an onion.
Oh. I feel like this is our first date, Matt.
It is.
I'm getting a lot of compliments over here.
Well, we did have that time of our long walk on the beach, which we should start the show off by explaining to people our special moment.
That's right.
So I'll let you do it.
So we're in the first meeting I've ever met Matt, and we're introducing ourselves to a large group of people. And they say, Matt, what do you enjoy doing? And Matt says, well, I enjoy long walks on the beach with my new friend, York Moore. I didn't know this guy from Adam. I'm like, who is this guy? Had me cracking up since the first time, and you've had me laughing ever since. So,
oh, thanks. Well, you've had me thinking ever since, and I appreciate your friendship and mentorship and everything that you bring to the relationship.
Yeah, you got it.
Especially those long walks. Okay, so let's start off with a little bit of background, talking about childhood, getting us through college, and kind of bump us into some of the career stuff that you had going on.
Yeah. So started early on in my life in abject poverty here in the great city of Detroit. My dad was a serial womanizer. I didn't know it at the time, but my mom was the other woman. And so my dad had a house, a family, multiple kids, and he had this thing with my mom. I didn't know that we were the other family. I just thought we were poor. And poverty went even further into poverty when drugs and alcohol entered into the story. And we ended up in homelessness. And we were in and out of homelessness for most of my childhood. Now, our homelessness was not what I would call typical homelessness. Even though drugs and alcohol were a part of that, really our homelessness was an intellectual homelessness. My parents were followers of a philosopher named Ayn Rand. Mm-hmm. I'm actually named after her. My first name is Rand. She's the founder of a philosophy called objectivism, which is a very ardent atheistic philosophy. And mostly because of their belief in her philosophy, they embraced a way that really, I think, set us up for homelessness. Radical individualism, a lack of respect and dependency on the state. So social programmings were something that they weren't interested in. And much of that came from Rand. I was homeschooled, learned how to read by reading Rand literature, Atlas Shrugged, We the Living, Anthem, those kinds of things. So it was just a very odd kind of homelessness, but I didn't know any better. My parents were both educated to the master's degree level. They were very intellectual. In our homeschooling, they had us doing things that were unusual for children our age. And so when I finally actually went to school in the 4th grade, because they were being threatened, the state was going to take us away because we were not in school, the truancy officer. Turns out, Matt, it's actually much harder to homeschool people in the 1970s than it is in 2025.
I would imagine
it was
so.
unheard of.
Yeah.
Right? So they finally sent us to school, but at the time we were actually squatting in an abandoned building. So we were stealing electricity, stealing water. It was a duplex, so we would just hot wire right into the next house. And we lived that way for over a year while I attended school for the first time in 4th grade.
Wow.
Those were just interesting times. So.
Wow. So, where did you go from there?
Yeah.
You got out of homelessness at some point.
At some point.
Got to through high school in the east side of Detroit or west side of Detroit.
So we were homeless. Most of our homelessness was on the west side of Detroit. When we got out of homelessness, we were living in a city called Inkster, Michigan, which is in some ways it was worse than being homeless because then it was a normalized. It was the height of the crack cocaine epidemic in the late 1980s. Prostitution all around my home, toxic waste dump right down the street, which we were litigating against. There was a class action lawsuit, which is part of how I actually escaped poverty. Was we actually had a very large settlement against this treatment plant, and but yeah, it was just the best way that I can describe it, Matt, is being homeless is like a scar on your soul that you constantly are reminded is there. So even though now I'm 56, I've been out of homelessness since, my late teens, but it's a scar that will never go away. And so just like physical scars in our lives, I think we can use them to our advantage. Scars from childhood trauma are not like physical scars in the sense that we get to show them off at the bar and tell a great story about them. They're more like the kinds of scars that you want to hide, you want to run away from. But I think if we'll let it, and we talked a little bit about this at lunch, if we allow ourselves to actually live into the pain and the trauma in a redemptive way, we can actually find a better story on the back end. We can find freedom from the things that used to oppress us. We can find an opportunity to be a better version of ourselves. And that's what I chose to do when I went to the University of Michigan. I started running from poverty, and that's what you don't want to do is just run from your trauma, run from your problems, because eventually...
Isn't that the natural...
It is.
That's the natural behavior, though, of a human.
It's the knee-jerk response that we all have to pain just in general, whether it's small pain or significant pain. But I think over the course of our lives, if we want to actually benefit from the scar, we actually have to re-wade into those waters and ask ourselves, how did that shape me? How is it continuing to shape me? You mentioned that we're both armchair psychologists, so I don't want to get too psychotherapeutic on you, Matt, but I think that's what I've probably spent the last 30 years of doing is unpacking a lot of the childhood trauma, which, as you know, drives you. It can drive a person like you, like me, to actually succeed in life by people's perception. We might look like successes, and there are lots of people walking around with scars. That doesn't mean that actually they've dealt with it. They've just turned that into some kind of success story.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you identified as a person with, you diagnosed me a bit over lunch and actually pointed something out to me that was really profound, the words that you used. And do you remember what you said?
Yeah. Well, immediately as soon as I met you, I'm like, oh, this guy has ADHD, which, who doesn't by these, everybody has ADHD now. But what was unique about you is that you are successful, you're productive, you command a room. Boy, I've been in some rooms where you have the entire room hanging on every word that you say. And so I thought to myself, here's a person who's probably in a good deal of turmoil or inner battle on a daily basis. You have a lot of adrenaline, probably a lot of highs, a lot of lows. So your inner world is probably a mixture of like exhilaration and like, anguish,
Frustration. Yeah.
frustration and anguish. So,
yeah. And then you kind of said, you said that you're kind of the opposite, right?
Yeah.
An opposite diagnosis of yourself. But going back to what you said about people with ADHD and what you said to me about when you have that high drive, fast moving, you're productive, to really watch out when you have those downtimes of, especially like when retirement comes, to really be prepared for, how do I handle those times? So I thought that was a profound thing to be thinking.
And we have a whole generation, I think, that's over medicated. I have a 15-year-old who's adopted, so her psychological history is hidden to us. We don't have access to it. And she has significant ADHD and almost to the point where she can't function. So medication for her, it was life-changing for us when we got the diagnosis. We put her on the medication and she started living a new kind of normal. I think a lot of times, though, we're too quickly to medicate our children. We have a generation of people who could be the next CEO of an Oxium, and we've dulled their intensity down because we worry about or it's difficult to put up with the side effects of ADHD. We've dumbed them down, and their ceiling is much lower now, what they're going to be able to accomplish. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to live with the kind of inner turmoil that you probably experience on a daily basis. Question is, it's all relative. Every person is different. But I do think we should be thinking pretty hard about whether or not medication is always the solution. What kind of great minds, what kind of women and men are we losing to our knee-jerk response to medicate and perhaps over-medicate because we don't want to deal with the consequences of disorders like anxiety and ADHD. And some of those can be very debilitating. So I'm not knocking. And, we have medicated our daughter significantly, and now she's regulated. She's actually able to function at school. But not everybody needs to immediately be medicated. And I think sometimes that prevents our society from experiencing the very best versions of people. You think of some of the great scientists, you think of some of the great entrepreneurs before these diagnoses were available. What they were capable of doing because they weren't medicated is pretty profound. So I guess it's a more complicated conversation. And parents who are living with this, it's I'm not throwing any shade on parents who medicate and who seek treatment. But I'm just thinking, boy, it's a complicated set of decisions, and we've over responded to the opportunity to medicate because it's there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we could pull this string on this sweater until the sweater was bare. But so much of that, I think, also revolves back to how much time is in the day to be able to deal with the problems at hand, right? And when we look at societally, that right now we're requiring, essentially to live, we're requiring a 2-income household in most cases. And so just the time that's allotted for the parenting tends to be, pretty constricted.
Yeah.
So it's, like I said, I think we could pull on that string and it could rip the sweater bare, but good thoughts.
Yeah.
What would be one piece of advice you could give to somebody who's considering it, maybe based on just what you've learned and maybe your observations out there?
Well, there are two audiences to the answer to that question. I think you've hit on something pretty key that in our society, unfortunately, we're forced into a 2-income, in most scenarios, a 2-income kind of home where parenting is done on the margins and our professional life is the main thing that we focus on. A person like you, like me, who occupies a CEO role, those demands are even greater. And so I do think, identifying and finding help early on. Not everybody has the financial means to hire an assistant or a nanny or a live-in cook. Most people don't have those options. But most people do have some version of those options. Can you budget so many nights? Now, I think a lot of people are over door dashing, but could you schedule some nights where you're having food delivered so that that cook time could be spent with, your child at the kitchen table, maybe doing homework or something tedious like that, whatever it might look like. I think identifying resources, no matter what your income level, no matter what your challenges are, finding resources that are going to be able to supplement your ongoing rhythms. I think that's number one. And really, quite honestly, I think number two would just be the role of faith. I don't want to get overly religious here, but I do think that at least, as a Christian, I believe that there are, spiritual contours to the problems that we're talking about. And so regardless of your faith background, I mean, I was an atheist for, the first 20 years of my life. And even as an atheist, atheists pray, And so whether you want to call it meditation or prayer, I don't care what you call it, you can't solve complex problems, whether it's mental health challenges or poverty, which are the two problems that we've talked about so far. I don't believe the durable solutions to problems that are that complex are as simple as medication or door dashing. There's a faith component that if we open ourselves up to, we can discover solutions that we didn't know were available.
You also gave me, and the reason why I want to bring this up and get back into the psychology thing for just one more minute is you also kind of gave me a diagnosis that you and Dr. ChatGPT came up with together for yourself, which really, what I appreciated with it was it really gave me an understanding of how your mind works. And I think it would be great for people to understand, how you think and how you think maybe differently than others. And maybe they can relate to that, or maybe they can at least just go, you know what? Now I understand that people think differently than I do.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned I went to school for the first time in fourth grade, and immediately I began to realize something was different. And I thought different was wrong. I thought, maybe there's something wrong with me. And what I mean by that is that as I would answer questions on tests or have conversations with kids on the playground, I immediately noticed that my experience of reality was different. And over the course of time, I learned that I have kind of a confluence of two, I wouldn't even call them disorders. They're just kind of like, they're truths about me, about my inner world. And one of them is that I have low latent inhibition with high intelligence. So a person with low latent inhibition experiences all of the extraneous data that a normal brain will filter out over time. So there are 3 wall outlets across from us right now. There is one light switch behind your head. There's a decorative plant behind your head. Now, if I were to come into this studio every day for the next 15 days, I wouldn't be able to tell you that. I'd have to re-examine on purpose those factoids about this room. But a person with low latent inhibition, their brain never filters out that extraneous data. And so it's always fresh and brand new. I gave you the illustration of when we have a farm and we have acreage on the farm and we'll walk our trail. And I have a couple of favorite spots that I like to, just take a breath and notice. And one of them is a beautiful hickory tree in the back west side of the property. And every time I walk by this tree, I stop and I breathe in deeply and I experience the tree as if it's the first time I've ever seen it, even though I've walked by this tree hundreds of times. And I think that's the lived reality of a person with low latent inhibition. Low intelligence oftentimes presents as kind of an autistic expression. So the data becomes so overwhelming to the person that it's almost like a Rain Man kind of response where they turn inward and they resist that data. A person with high intelligence can actually navigate that in all of that data and use it to her or his benefit. The other condition that I just discovered that I have is time distortion disorder, which sounds terrible, but I think it's pretty awesome. So I don't know if I was listening to NPR or something. It was maybe it was a podcast and they were talking about this disorder. And I'm like, wow, that's exactly how I experience life. It's almost as if everything is in slow motion. So athletes will refer to this as flow. People who study the psychology of athletes, you can be doing a sweet layup. We're watching the NBA championship right now, and it'll undoubtedly be the Pacers and who else won the other night?
You're asking the wrong guy.
I'm asking the wrong guy. Your game is golf. But the study that
7 times last year. Yes.
7
My game was
times
golf. Yeah.
7 times more than I do. But a person will drive the ball down the court. They'll get into the paint. They'll do a layup, and all of that took like 2.8 seconds on the clock. But the athlete experiences that as a very slow motion kind of lived experience. And that's how I experience everything. So my day is like literally 5 days in a normal person's experience. So you take that low latent inhibition where I have all this extraneous data and this time distortion disorder that I have where I experience life as if I'm just like, circumventing the room in slow motion while everything else is, everybody else is experiencing that fast. I have a disadvantage when it comes to actually being in a room with people, thinking about ideas, because I'm thinking about them in this flow type state.
But you're almost getting to research longer.
Yes.
In the true time allotted.
Yeah, that's right.
This episode of the BLTnT Podcast is sponsored by Auxium, business IT and cybersecurity designed to outsmart chaos. And powered by Juniper Networks. Automate your network with Juniper Networks and the Mist AI platform, the world's first AI-driven wired and wireless network.
And, for you and I, we're like kids in a candy store, whether you're on that end of the spectrum, you have this ADHD that you struggle with. I have these two disorders. And now infused in that moment is, I think, one of the biggest evolutionary moments in human history with the onset of generative artificial intelligence. So now to your brain that thinks in this way and to my brain that thinks this way, we can insert a third brain. And I use lots and lots of different AIs. And boy, I'm 56. I wish I was like 26. I wish I was at the beginning of my life, at the beginning of this technology, because what it's been able to do is fast track the best version of myself and supplement the way in which I think about the world and the way in which I create content or whatever it might be. I have a third brain, right? So that's pretty amazing.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Let's also touch back here because I want to understand how you became a farmer. But you did mention earlier you were an atheist for the first 20 years of your life.
That's right.
And then you found the Lord and been on a different path ever since. And you're a pastor now and got quite a story. So walk us through a little bit of that, and then want to hear about farming, and definitely want to get on this AI train.
Yeah,
here,
for sure.
as well.
Yeah, we'll call this podcast the potpourri because you're getting a little bit of everything: some armchair psychology, some Gen AI, and now Jesus Christ. Right? So I was atheist, and my parents, when we weren't homeless, we had a sign on the front of our home that said "the Moors, the atheists." We had a barrel for burning Bibles, so we weren't your garden variety, occasional kind of decorative atheists. We were serious about this. So when I went to Michigan, my nickname in my fraternity was Satan, persecuted Christians, wrote papers against Christians. But I went to college, unlike most people who wanted to go to get a great job or find the perfect, soulmate. I went to discover the meaning of the universe. Can life have meaning and purpose if there's no transcendence? So I'll use that word in place of God because I know that not all of your listeners, have a faith journey. But I would say that for me, I was unwilling to simply just consume. So I think most people in America are what I call functional atheists, even if they're church people. What we basically are consumers, and we're consumers of pleasure, we're consumers of goods, and we're consumers of, experiences. And so we like to curate these experiences. We curate our experience of coffee. We curate our experience of sex. We curate our experience of fill in the blank. But basically, we're curators of things that don't actually have any kind of permanence or transcendence. And so for me, I was unwilling at
things that rust.
Yeah, things that rust, things that won't last, things that don't have any kind of eternal purpose. And I thought, well, okay, if there's no God, that means there's no eternality. And therefore nothing has permanence. Can we have meaning in a world where there's no transcendence. That was the reason I went to college. And so I spent my first 3 years trying to answer that question, became an honors student in the psychology department and the philosophy department. And that 1-2 combo, I thought, well, I'll find some, if there's meaning to be found, I'll find it in those realms. In the psychology department, I was driven into the data science portion of that because I didn't want to go back to poverty. So I knew philosophers were largely poor, right? Or they went on to law school, and that didn't really interest me too much. And I didn't want to go back to poverty, so I did the data science. And I became an honors student in both departments. But all the while, I'm trying to answer this question, can life have meaning without transcendence? And, after 3 years, Matt, I decided the answer was no. Like I'd done all the reading, I'd read the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, and I talked to Christians and Muslims and went to mosque, and I read all the great philosophers, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and, tried to figure out which has a better value ecosystem and why. And I did all the things, which is also where I started getting into artificial intelligence back literally in the 1980s. Artificial intelligence was a thing. It was the property of the cognitive science realm. And I went deep into that. My plan was to go to MIT to study AI in 1991. That's when I graduated. But I remember, turning my honors thesis into the chairperson of my program in the philosophy department. And basically, Matt, it was an articulation of my atheistic conclusion that there is no God, life has no meaning, transcendence it's occasional, or it's manufactured, it's contextual, conventional. And because that's true, there can actually be no meaning in the world. And so if there's no meaning, why should I live a day or 100 million years? If I die and cease to exist, why not just get it over with? Because it doesn't matter how much sex or material possessions or, success you have, why not just die? And so I decided that I was going to kill myself. And before I did that, I thought, well, out of all the gods that I've studied, out of all the religions that I studied, the only one that I'm going to have a problem with is Jesus, because the Bible is the only religious text that said very, very black and white statements like it's appointed unto us once to die and then to face judgment. So if the Quran and Allah were the true religion, I could work myself out of hell. If Buddha or Krishna were the true gods, I'd have lots of opportunities around the wheel of reincarnation to get it right. Mm-hmm. But if Jesus was the one true God, then, well, I was going to be making a big mistake by killing myself. So I went on an interviewing spree. I interviewed my pastor. I had a pastor friend simply because, the girls in church were a little easier to get along with, if you know what I mean, than the ones out on the street. And, all of the Christians that I interviewed and, I went back and tried to reread the Bible. None of them really, it didn't connect with my soul. I didn't see the reason. And so I decided to kill myself. And so December 24th, 1989, I'm in a car driving 90 miles an hour, fully determined to kill myself in my car at the viaduct near my home. And my decision was to smash the car and kill myself. And as I got that twisted sense of courage, fully intending to do the deed, I would say now, in the words that I'm able to use now, that a power and a presence entered the vehicle and steered me to safety. Now, I still didn't know, well, which God did that? And was it God? It was just enough of an experience, Matt, to get me home on Christmas Eve. I woke up on Christmas Day, and for the first time in my life, I prayed a prayer of desperation. I said, God, if that's you, I need to know right now, because I'm still going to kill myself. The experience was extraordinary. It was a super phenomenal, experience, but it wasn't enough to actually change my mind. So I went into the other room, and, my two older brothers were also at Michigan. We were all home for Christmas, and one of them had brought the poem, Footprints in the Sand. It was a picture frame poem, the story Footprints in the Sand, which, if you're unfamiliar with it, it's just almost like a Hallmark card type story about how God is caring for us, even when we're not aware of his presence, and particularly during times where, we are at our worst. God is working in our lives. I'm looking at this picture, and I had read it before, and I thought, this is, nonsense. Mm-hmm. But as I'm reading this for the first time, I actually hear the voice of God louder than I could shout to you in your ears. It was as if his voice was saturating my entire body. And he said 3 things that changed my life. He said, number 1, I do exist. Number 2, I'm the reason why you exist. Those are the only 2 data points I needed as a philosopher. Everything else would have been a derivative. But the third thing he said sent me into the other room in tears. He said, and I'm the one who kept you from killing yourself last night, which meant that God knew who I was. He was involved in my life and he cared. And I went into the other room and I said, well, God, if you can take my life and make anything out of it from this day forward, I'm going to live for you. So that's how my faith journey started in a very unusual way during an attempted suicide, not because I was depressed or distraught, but because I had made a rational decision that
none of it mattered.
None of it mattered. That's right.
Okay, that's heavy duty. Yeah, I can't beat that. I have no story that beats that.
Yeah, well, we could talk about your bare ankles.
That's true. You could, yeah, but the camera's got those hidden right now, so that's a good thing. So I mean, what a shift from, full on atheism, not just passive, but exceptionally active, to now here you are, a pastor, and running a Christian organization. So, tell me how you leverage that experience of how you grew up, maybe different than the person who, in Catholicism, they call it a cradle Catholic or a cradle Christian or whatever. Like from somebody who grew up with that, where it's the only thing we've known, our whole life. How's that parlay and make you a better leader in the realm that you're in?
Well, I think the one word that I would use would be transformation. When you've had a series of transformative moments in your life where there's been these incredible ups and downs, like literally living in an abandoned building, having to use the bathroom in a can, being on the verge of suicide, having this radical experience. Christians call it becoming born again, whether or not you like or hate that phrase or not. I had a born again experience. And so because of that, I think as a leader, I know that change is possible. So I took over the organization that I'm running right now. It's a 50-year-old legacy organization. It was dying. It was struggling financially. It had recently had a fairly public scandal. But I'm in the business of seeing resurrection. I'm in the business of actually seeing that what once was dead and hopeless is now alive and flourishing. And so it was an opportunity for me to actually take my life experience and actually apply it in the professional setting. We're not a P&L organization. We're a nonprofit. The rules of engagement are exceedingly different. Our bottom line isn't the bottom line, but I think the principles are the same. The principles of leadership, of curiosity and understanding the moment and the market context, and understanding that people aren't oftentimes inspired to do their best work simply by the paycheck that we can provide them, but by the mission that they're on. Every P&L business, I think, is always going to be better if their employees are actually tied to a core mission that fits their vision for the world and for life. And you understand that here at Oxford. So we're doing that in the religious nonprofit space. So we're a college ministry that was for 50 years operating largely in one state. Now we've grown 50% in the last 36 months. We're operating in 16 states with a couple of hundred employees. And our next 3-year strategic plan is to grow another 50% and multiply our presence across the United States. I think all of that's possible when leaders who have had transformative experiences apply those experiences to their leadership in the business place, in the workplace.
I mean, and it gives hope, right? I mean, I was speaking with a gentleman who's another pastor, and he says, look, even if we're all wrong, at least we have hope.
Yeah.
Right. We lived with hope. So I think that's always, the final saving grace, even if we're all wrong.
That's right.
But, and I think that the hope though, for you, right, what you're able to instill on people who you're trying to transform is that you actually know what low feels like.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
And you know what hopelessness feels like.
Yeah, that's right. And we're working with college students, which in my mind are the elite of the elite. I don't know if you knew this, but only 1% of the world's population has a college degree from a 4-year college.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And the United States leads the way by far academically when it comes to, access to not public, but to higher education.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you're working with women and men who are at the beginning of their trajectory. And so what we're trying to do in the Coalition for Christian Outreach is mentor these women and men into the workplace. So you've seen a lot of employees come and you've seen a lot of employees go. And the best, I would be willing to bet, Matt, that the best employees that you've experienced are people who are mission driven, people who not just know how to do a task, but they have a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're working now with 18,000 students in 16 states, and we're mentoring them into the workplace. So they go into the workplace with a sense of mission and drive. And that, I think, is increasingly rare in a world where first millennials and now Gen Z that are entering the workplace, they have no sense of corporate loyalty, yet they are mission driven, and they are driven by these greater kind of global ideas, a longing for justice, a longing for a world made right, which is one of the topics of one of my 4 books. And hiring those kinds of people are going to save you time, energy. They're going to be self-driven. They're going to need less management, less oversight. You're not going to have to worry about compliance because they're working for you. And it doesn't matter if they're working for us in a religious nonprofit or a P&L oriented business. They're going to work with a sense of inner drive that is peculiar. And that's what we're doing in the CCO, Coalition for Christian Outreach. We're launching an army of young people who are going to go into the workplace, into pharmacy and physics and chemistry and generative AI with this inner drive that they're actually making the world a better place through their employment.
Apropos that you and I were in the workshop with Jay Reifenberry the day that we were chatting it up, where he says you got to come up with your core 4. What are your core beliefs? What is your mission?
Yeah.
Right. And how's that? Those people that you're mentoring are tying themselves to the higher mission.
Yeah.
The highest mission, I should say, that's truly driving them.
Yeah.
So you're trying to build a valuable human in the workplace,
that's right.
Regardless of what the industry is that they're pursuing.
It's funny because you actually mentioned how odd it is to talk to some religious people, right? And religious people make everything almost as if it's another world.
Church talk,
I think. That's the phrase you use. And what's interesting is that if you study American evangelicalism throughout American history, largely what we've said to people, either directly or indirectly, is that the highest version of yourself is to read your Bible, pray, and go to church. And everything else is superfluous. And I just don't believe that that's what the Bible teaches. And our organization teaches that a pastor, a missionary, an evangelist, that's not some higher calling than being a physicist or somebody who's training large language models. One of the best stories recently that I've heard was a guy who became a Christian through our organization. And he went into the family business, which was a chemical company. And they were making paint. And I flew down to visit with him down in Cincinnati, and he said, York, when I began to realize that God cared not only about the money that my paint was making, but he cared about the polymers and the chemical transformations that produced the paint, I became obsessed with the science. So I bought out my competitors. Now I own 3 chemical companies because I want to do the science. I don't want some other schmuck to do the science. I want to do the science, right? So I do think the way in which we think about our place in the world as participating in the redemptive purposes of God applies to every single area of life, not just the people who go into religious work. You doing your work as the CEO of Auxium, it has a redemptive part to play in God's world and God's desire to make everything new. Whether or not you believe that or not is beside the point. I think God is going to use your talents and your company for his purposes, whether or not you give him the glory, whether or not you give a nickel of your profits to, other nonprofits or whatever it might be. All of what we're doing is all, I think, a part of God's redemptive purposes to make all things new. Now, there's some exceptions, of course, people who are, I did 15 years of anti-trafficking here in the United States and Cambodia. That has no redemptive value.
Sure.
People who are producing pornography. has no redemptive value. That's not something that God is going to use for his good. I'm talking about like the work that God has called us to. It's interesting, Matt. I think the very first story that we get in the Bible is a story of the gift of work, where God says he puts Adam and Eve in the garden and he blesses them with the gift of work. Work became cursed after sin entered the world. But his first charge to human beings was be fruitful, subdue the earth, multiply, and fill it. That's called work. So there is their good news in work.
I just had my friend Paul Glantz here yesterday, and you know, he wants to remain productive until the day that he dies.
Wow.
You know, he feels like he's doing what he's supposed to on this earth if he's being productive. You know, he wants to consistently deliver value in excess of his cost. And people have heard me say that. I actually didn't realize until just the other day. I said, I think that might have been you that told me that first, and gave him some credit for that. But
yeah, did Paul ask you to silence your cell phone?
He did. Yeah, there was a whole trailer at the beginning of our discussion here, which was tough for me to have to do that, but I did it. I did it for the hour and a half that we talked. But no, just that redemptive value, or that I mean, we think about when you, and I don't want to say that everything that feels good is good, but after a hard day of work, it feels good. Right. After, you know, you've contributed to society,
that's right.
It feels good. If you've served somebody else, it feels good, and it feels good for the right reason. The thing about hard work, you know, it always makes me think about you being a farmer, right? Did you ever think you were going to be a farmer?
Never in my wildest dreams. I didn't even know how people got into that.
And now you're fending off
I'm killing
hawks with
things left and right,
groundhogs.
Yeah.
I've been hearing a lot lately about the knock. When an employee knocks on your office door and says, "Got a minute?" and you immediately know it's some sort of IT incident. But Oxium IT can help. Whether you're having a problem, need consulting, an upgrade, or a managed IT approach, they focus on preventing cyber attacks and proactive solutions that deliver results. My friend Matt Loria and everyone at Oxium are ready to help before or after you get the knock. Visit Oxium.com and let Oxium IT help you outsmart chaos.
No, it started with my wife. Actually, we had decided to move to Orlando right before the pandemic, and we flew down there several times. We found a house in a community that we liked, and our intention was to sell our house and move to Orlando. And then we get back, and she just had a different spirit about her. She said, "You know, I think we're making the wrong choice. What if we stayed in Michigan and bought a hobby farm?" And I said, "I'm a black man from Detroit. I don't even know what a hobby farm is." I had no idea what a hobby farm was. And she said, "I'll just keep an open mind." So then she started taking me to these places, terrible places. I wouldn't put my dog in these places. And I said, "Oh man, maybe she doesn't even know how to use Zillow right, because she's taking me to terrible." So I put in all of the parameters, barn and acreage, and up popped this beautiful home. I'm like, "Why didn't she show me this?" Well, it was like $1,000 over the maximum that I gave her.
Oh, okay.
She should have just ignored me. So we went out and we looked at this farm, and it was a little slice of heaven. 115-year-old, beautiful farmhouse, 8 buildings, cinder block barn, sitting on 10 acres, which I've discovered when you buy land, you know what you want more of? Land.
Oh, yeah.
So we would love to have more land. But we went there, and of course the realtor then says, she shows us the house and says, "Oh, but it's sold." That just shows you the heart of a realtor. They just want your business, you know. So if you're a realtor out there, you know, keep your number to yourself. Don't friend me on LinkedIn. Realtors aren't my favorite people. But the realtor said,
generally speaking, stereotyping. I'm sure
I
there's
know
one
or two.
There's a couple good ones out there.
In fact, they are my LinkedIn
Okay, good.
friends. But the realtor has made the mistake of telling my wife, "Well, you can always put in a contingency offer." Well, that gave my wife hope. And you don't know my wife, but my wife is like a dog with a bone when she wants something. So she went home, and this was before ChatGPT. It would have been an even better letter had we had ChatGPT in 2020. And she wrote this great letter about how we're going to bring farms back to animals back to the farm, and we're going to raise our kids there. And this big sappy letter. And believe it or not, the estate that was selling the farm literally let their previous buyer go and sold us the farm.
Really?
At the same price point. So we actually literally stole the farm. And then I get there, Matt, and I'm
bought the farm.
Yeah, we bought the farm and stole the farm. Both idioms there.
Yeah.
And I get on the farm, and I have this experience that I didn't know what was happening at first. It's a pandemic. So we're locked down, you know, literally you can't even drive your car across state lines if you remember those early days. And we're fixing everything and we're killing everything. We're doing all this work on the farm. And all of a sudden I start realizing like, this is good for my soul. Like I had lived my entire life running away from poverty, and how oftentimes we express that in our trauma is we control what we can control. So you see poverty, people in poverty, they'll control their outfits or their hair or their cars, always polished. We call it ghetto rich, ghetto fabulous, ghetto rich. And it's an expression of control in response to the trauma of poverty. And for me, I was living with this without knowing that I was living with this. So every house that I had owned before was a brand new construction, or was a flip. It was immaculate. Everything was perfect. The grass, the landscaping was beautiful because I could control a 60-foot lot. When I moved to a 115-year-old farm on 10 acres where everything's trying to kill me or I have to kill it, and everything's broken, gutters hanging down over here. So all of a sudden I'm becoming handy, but I'm also experiencing a level of freedom and restoration and healing that therapy couldn't give me. So you talk about the good work that you go to bed with that feeling of good work. Yesterday I did, and so people who farm will understand what I'm talking about because I don't have a quick hitch. I had to change implements on my tractor, and I had to put the brush hog deck on for the first time this season. You want to talk about a bunch of rigmarole. You want to talk about something that is they've made something called a quick hitch. I don't have a quick hitch. It was very frustrating, and I'm sweating and I'm filthy and I'm covered with grease, and I go in, I'm just like, oh, it's the best day. So there's something I think that's like healing about work. We were made for work, right? And so when we actually live into work in a redemptive way and embrace that. So I think actually I had an experience moving to a farm that has been, it's just been like medicine to my soul. And now we have cows and goats and chickens and ducks and bees. We got all the things. But to me, like the real gift of the farm is the gift of work.
That's great. You also brought up to me, you said people from poverty, what kind of how their trauma kind of expresses itself, right? And you use the words ghetto rich, ghetto fabulous, perfection in these objects. And then you talked about, that it's really just, we're all kind of negotiating our inner world in some way, right? And we're trying to make right something somewhere. We're trying to fix something, even if we don't know it. Right. And then you said, look, and the wealthy are, kids from wealthy places dealing with their inner problems are dealing with things like eating disorders and things like that.
Yeah.
Talk about that and how or why you think we're all seeking that I don't know, whether it's a healing or whatever it is that you'd think.
I think the world and human beings along with the world was created for order and beauty. And so my third book, Do Something Beautiful, it talks a lot about this. I think for people, no matter what their trauma is, the response to disorder and ugliness, whether it's the ugliness of physical or sexual abuse, or it's the ugliness of, yet another crack cocaine user being found dead in the burned out building across the street from my home, that's ugliness. And that's something that's not the world that God created. It's not the world that we were created for. And so because of that, I think whenever we experience that, our knee-jerk reaction is to control what can be controlled. And you see this in young kids. They'll hold themselves, they'll rock themselves. They express a high level of control around their physicality. And the older we get, the more sophisticated ways we find to control our circumstances. I think people who have a lot of resources will oftentimes be more prone to eating disorders, and that's certainly statistically true. We see eating disorders exponentially higher in, families of wealth. Well, that's a child or a young girl oftentimes trying to express a level of control in an otherwise uncontrolled situation, regardless of what, she's struggling with. So I just think that's kind of like in human nature is to control what we can control as an expression of response to trauma or a set of circumstances that are habitually out of control. I think that's natural and normal. Again, I'm an armchair psychologist, so like I don't I'm not consulting to DSM, whatever we're up to.
Yeah, right.
now, but,
DSM 5 or 6 or 7, wherever we are now. It's funny you talk about order and control and everything like that. And I'm thinking to myself, the article that I just read, I can't remember which guy it was. I could look it up, but it's one of the major artificial intelligence platforms. He came out and said that he's predicting that 50% of 50% of white collar jobs could be gone. I'm sorry, 50% of entry level white collar jobs will be gone in the next 1 to 5 years. Yeah. Okay. And then he's saying that he believes that will lead to 10 to 20% unemployment. Right.
Wow.
So obviously, let's just say he's half right. Okay. Or let's say that the economists, I mean, you've seen the article that I wrote about the economy meeting with AI, meeting with other automation and perhaps some policy concerns, kind of all intersecting at the same time, could really cause some major disruption in our economy in the 2030s. And so a lot of trauma lies ahead, right, for a lot of people. And the preparation of that is I mean, we can't just be sitting here ignoring it. So when you talked about this AI in the mind of God, help us understand, how maybe we can get ahead of certain things. Help us understand why it can be such a beautiful thing and great for our society, and just everything that you talked about, because I'm only surmising what you may have talked about in that, because as I told you before, I didn't read it, I didn't watch it or listen to it, because I wanted to hear it fresh from you for the first time myself.
Yeah. Well, it's funny how I actually got, I invited myself to speak at the conference. It's the largest conference on AI in North America. It's called AI4, and it's in August in Las Vegas. And so the algorithm knew that I was interested in AI and said, hey, you should go to this conference. And so I registered for the conference, and it was a pretty expensive registration, a couple grand. And within 30 minutes, the conference messaged me back, and they said, oh, you're a CEO. You don't have to pay. We'll pay for you to, we'll pay your registration. I said, boy, that's really generous. What would be even better is if you had me speak. And they said, well, that's unusual. And I said, well, just hop on a Zoom and I can tell you why you need me there. So I wasn't trying to speak on their platform. They had very, very important people on the platform.
Sure.
Executive VP of AWS gave a fantastic message demonstrating how we're really at the less than 1% marker in terms of
where
real
this is
integration.
Going.
Yeah. And so it was an exhilarating conference. But I jumped on the call with the guy, Dan, who owns the conference. And I said, Dan, you have a philosophy degree from Rutgers, and I have a philosophy degree from Michigan. You and I both know that Gen AI is actually not going to solve the enduring questions of transcendence, meaning, purpose, belonging, God, faith, whatever you might put into that bucket. It's going to accelerate those questions. We're now asking questions about sentience, singularity, if there's no distinguishable difference between a large language model's behavior from a sentient,
By the way, be sure to define each of the words that you're using here, just in case somebody doesn't
so
know,
like
including
the idea,
myself.
Yeah, the idea of singularity is this idea of the genesis of sentience in an artificial intelligence. And so I think the time is coming very quickly where we're not going to use the word artificial. It's an intelligence. It might not be sentient, meaning that it has self-awareness. But we're at the beginning of what I would argue is the greatest evolution of what it means to be human in all of human history. And I mean that with all my mind. AI changes what it actually means to be a human being. And what I mean by that is it's not going to change our DNA. I don't believe that, there's a whole, it's probably 40 something years old, this whole idea of, integrating our consciousness with machines. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that if you think about the lived human experience before air travel was possible, air travel changed what it meant to be a human being. You could live here and transport yourself over time to another part of the continent or even another continent. You could do that through ships, but air travel changed what it meant to be human. The internet has changed what it means to be human. I think we are at the precipice of what we are calling generative artificial intelligence, and I think it will be called something different sometime soon, that's going to change the lived human experience, whether or not you're sleeping or awake, whether you're having intercourse with your wife or enjoying a great meal like we just had, artificial intelligence is going to touch every single aspect of the lived human experience. That means that it has to be thought of critically. We can't just allow this technology as a convenience to come into our lives and into our world without critical thought. And so oftentimes, Americans they assign utility to everything. Everything has purpose because it has utility for me. So meaning comes from purpose, or it comes from like the functionality. So I have a water bottle here, which is quite popular. It's it's called the Awala water cup. My drinking consumption of water has grown 3,000% because of this technology. All right? So it has meaning because it serves a purpose or a function in my life. Gen AI is not like that. Gen AI actually transcends the functionality that it presents. So right now, you and I use it as CEOs quite often in a wide variety of ways. We're using artificial intelligence. But I think artificial intelligence is actually going to not just be a tool that human beings use, it's going to shape what it means to be human. And so you talk about the loss of, entry-level, white-collar jobs. The internet did the same thing. It replaced automation. So I don't have a teller anymore. I go to an ATM. I don't have a clerk. I go to the self-checkout line. Internet 1.0 displaced large numbers of people for jobs that were redundant and something that a machine could easily learn to do. This is not like that. This is going to be so disruptive that it's going to upend, lawyers, contract lawyers, and people, the Supreme Court justices across the country are already using artificial intelligence to examine case law and, compliance and regulation and all these kinds of things. It's already being integrated into every aspect of life. So
that would have normally taken hundreds of thousands of hours of interns or clerks or paralegals to go through, prepare, try to summarize, find, and bring it to the person in a digestible format.
Yeah, that's right. So I think the scale that we're looking at for disruption, I don't know if I would agree that 10, 20% unemployment. Human beings are incredibly adaptable, it turns out. And it turns out that every disruption, whether we're talking about the Industrial Revolution or the aftermath of great wars, it turns out that people have a resilience where they find themselves having meaning and purpose. We cannot not, and here's where I'll go with what I presented at AI4, we cannot not make meaning. It's always in our nature to make meaning. So if I go back to Genesis 1:26, and this isn't a church and I'm not trying to preach, but Genesis 1:26 through 28 is God's first instruction to human beings. It's what theologians call the cultural mandate. I prefer to call it the meaning mandate. So at AI4, in my session, which, by the way, had a line out the door and down the hall, and people were on the floor and pressed up against the wall at a tech show, at a tech conference, to have a conversation about the generative AI and the mind of God.
In Sin City.
In Sin City, that's right. So it was no small feat. In fact, I told them, I said, my wife's asleep upstairs in the hotel room, and she's never going to believe that anybody showed up because I wore a terrible shirt. She mocked me for my shirt. And I said, and it was the time slot where I got to check out of the MGM, so everybody's like rolling with their roller bags. And I said, she's never going to believe that anybody showed up. I got to take a selfie. So I have a picture of this, all these CTOs, CIOs pressed up against the wall, hedge fund geniuses. They're there. Why are they there? Because they're hungry for meaning and an interpretive lens for this moment that everybody in the industry, everybody understands this is more powerful than a nuclear bomb. And we're playing with either something very beautiful or very destructive. And it's both and. And so Genesis 1:26 through 28 says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. And when God said those words, he wasn't just imagining eating fruit from fruit trees and making babies. He imagined nanotechnology and espresso machines and the Roman road and cruise ships and airliners and all the things, including generative artificial intelligence. All of those things that human beings have created over the course of the eons all demonstrate what God deposited in our soul in Genesis 1:26. You as a human being, Matt, cannot not make meaning. You get up every day, whether or not it's meaning that you're creating something that is for the benefit of mankind or maybe your family, or maybe it's destructive, but it's in your nature to make meaning. So here I'm in this room.
To make meaning and or find meaning.
Yes,
Both?
both. Yes, both. And that's, I think if we had longer, we could talk about, finding meaning and where do we actually find meaning.
But we all want to be, to just dumb that down just a little bit is we all want to be meaningful.
Yes.
We all want to be relevant.
Mm-hmm.
We all want to be impactful, or like Paul said, we want to be productive.
Yeah.
That's part of meaning.
Yeah, it is. I think, and I think we're so driven by it that when we're not in a meaning-making pattern in our lives, the results are things like alcoholism, things like suicide, things like self-harm, things like, all the self-destructive, or we destroy others, but work and meaning making is, I think, the pathway to finding purpose in the world. So here I am in this room and we do 10 minutes on, 10 minutes off. And I said to them, I don't care if you're atheist, agnostic, Hindu, Muslim, I happen to be Christian. We need to talk about how to think through an ethical lens using our worldview to have a conversation of meaning and purpose when it comes to Gen AI. And then I said these words, and literally I had people choking up with tears in the room. I said, what you all are involved in is creating something that is so meaningful and beautiful that it's going to change the world. And in fact, it's already changed the world. You're involved in a spinning world of wonder that has the potential to usher in the greatest moment of human flourishing. It's going to have some disruption.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be some collateral damage. In the long run, I think what Gen AI has the potential to do is redefine what it means to be human in a way that actually restores what we lost when sin entered the world. And I'm saying these words. I said, this is my worldview. This as a Christian, this is how I interpret this moment that we're in. I had people crying, and
they feel like they're a part of something.
And they
bigger
should.
than themselves.
That's right. And they should. This moment that we're in, and you read what Altman is after, you read what Musk is after, the vision that these great women and men who are involved in this moment, what they're after, it's not going to change the world. It has already irreversibly changed what it means to be human. And we're literally at less than the 1% marker where this is actually going.
It's funny. I just had the little glimpse into a thought of that about how dramatically changing this all is. And you use the ATM and the teller and use those examples. And then you talked about the scanner at the grocery store and changing the human experience. Like I think what people don't understand is that it's not going to just be that there's not a person at the cash register. There's not even going to be a store, right? The store can be an automated thing that is sensing, what needs to be at your home at any given time. And we're already started down that road. I mean, if you don't think AWS or Amazon and all of their services are highly AI driven, you're missing them. Missing the obvious.
The in-store experience at Walmart's about to change. I don't know if you saw that, but they're integrating AI into the in-store shopping experience.
Well, they did it at Sam's Club already, where you can scan your own items as you go, and that's just the start of it, and just walk right out.
That's right. Which is why I'm a Sam's Club member instead of a Costco.
I'm both.
I'd rather be Costco, but I'm not standing in a Costco line. I don't care how good their whipped cream is.
That drives me nuts every time to have to show that receipt. So build on what I'm saying. What are some of your visions of what the future will look like? How dramatically different will human existence be that maybe others haven't thought of, like that you might be able to share what's in your mind?
Well, I mean, I can't even imagine, That's why I said I wish I was 26 instead of 56. I wish I could see how this thing actually evolves. But I think there's a if we can think of in terms of movie metaphors, I'm a huge fan of the horror genre and not all of the subgenres, but I'm obsessed with horror movies. I think there's a horror movie version of how this could go. And I think if you listen to Altman and people who are thinking thoughtfully about this, they know that the horror show version is a real possibility and probably a probability given the fact that human beings tend to use technology to destroy their enemies and pleasure themselves, right? And the internet is the internet today because of video games and pornography. Like it wouldn't exist if it weren't for those two drivers in the early days of the internet. So Gen AI is definitely going to have not just a shadow side. I think its dominant expression is going to be used, to capitalize at the expense of the marginalized and the at-risk. It's going to be used to pleasure ourselves with all kinds of, unimaginable expressions of eroticism. This is just unfortunately, because of sin, my worldview, this is what we do with everything that we create. A shovel isn't just a shovel, Matt. It's also a weapon that I can use to decapitate you, right? That's in the mind of every person. So I think there's a horror show version of this. I think that after a time of disruption, we're going to figure out the dangers and the risks, whether or not that'll be too late or not, whether or not we've handed ourselves over to the machine, so to speak. It's interesting that all of these old Skynet Terminator films are all over. Every time I turn on the TV, it's like a Skynet Terminator movie. And yeah, I think that's our greatest fear, is that we've created something that now we are going to actually be subjugated to. And I think we already are in some ways, right? Like my phone is listening to this conversation right now. I'm going to get in my car, drive back to my farm, and I can guarantee you in my feed, there are going to be elements of this conversation.
You bet.
I'm already subjected to unwillingly. Now, I tend to opt into everything. I always say, Google has made my life better. It would make it even better if I clicked yes on every single thing.
Listen to everything.
I'm that guy, right?
Yeah, okay.
But I think at its best, I think that Gen AI actually represents an opportunity to accelerate the kind of human flourishing and the flourishing of the world that God had in mind in the garden. What was lost in sin can, I think, not be restored through technology. I wouldn't be naive enough to say that. But I do think that just like the creation of antibiotics, or the creation of fill in the blank, anything that actually has produced a good in the world, I think Gen AI can actually be exponentially more powerful.
Sure.
You think about, one of the most interesting conversations I had at the AI4 conference was at the speaker's cocktail hour. I met a guy, a genius, just a guy who was using Gen AI in DNA sequencing to create new drugs to treat untreatable diseases. And I'm listening to this guy's vision for the world. And he's an atheist. He tells me, he says, why are you here? And I said, well, I'm going to talk about the Bible at this tech show. And he's like, oh, that's odd, and, but I was willing to listen to his story. And as he's giving me his vision for what he wants to accomplish, and he's from the UK, and so he had a real sexy voice too. So I was already interested from the get-go. His vision is to make people well. Right. So I think the best version of ourselves can be more possible, more likely, because we have this powerful third brain.
Sure.
In large language models.
So, I'll give you just a simplified today version of that. My aunt was just recently diagnosed with cancer that came back and is metastasized in a lot of places. And between my cousin and I, we took her medical records, pumped them into ChatGPT, each into our own instances, pumped them into ChatGPT, found the 3 hospitals that were best suited for her, for her particular strain, if you will. Got to see everything that was going to be the proposed treatment plans and everything like that. And it worked out almost spot on to exactly what the doctor said.
Wow.
Now, was there value in that? I don't know. It didn't really get speed to treatment, because of that. But I can tell you this, normally speaking, I would have been calling her and saying, what happened at the appointment? What did they say? And then you dig in and you hang on to every word that the doctor says that gives you hope or gives you dread or whatever emotion, the word exhibits in you. And I'm thinking, man, I have not had to call her once and ask her what's happening next. I already know what's happening next. So I'm just able to just be there for her as the human, right? And not have to be this inquisitive, anxious human going, wonder what they're going to say. No, I kind of knew what they were going to say. And the same for my cousin. She was able to keep the calm. So we're the steadfast ones in the storm with her, while she's dealing with it.
Wow. And well, first of all, let me just say, I'm sorry, the diagnosis. So,
well, thank you. Thank you. I mean, so far she's doing okay, but we'll keep praying that she keeps going in that direction. But it's just like, there's so many great things, but you pointed out the the negatives that are gonna.
Yeah.
I mean, we're human. They're gonna.
Yeah.
We're gonna pull some bad stuff together here.
Well, the best use case of ChatGPT, which is one of the AIs that I use on a regular basis, the best use case was when my super cute, super single 22-year-old wanted to break up with a super clingy guy, and she's a people pleaser. She just couldn't bring herself to do it. And I said, let's use our third brain. And we crafted the most beautiful breakup text that you would ever had read. And she broke up with him. He called and thanked her for breaking up with him. Like the power of ChatGPT,
Wow.
if it can actually do that, end a relationship well as a use case, is an example of what is possible.
Yeah. But I mean, that third brain was, it took elements of human emotion that it could understand, right, through the large language models and through the different processing. And it was acting, as a different, I mean, you're a dad, man. You're loaded for bear.
Yes.
Right. And she's emotional about it. And she's also a people pleaser, like you said. So that third brain was bringing in the psychologist or whatever, the sage advice in that situation.
That's
so
right.
That's fantastic stuff. So let's talk about your family real quick here. Tell everybody about your family. I know, you have a super cute, super single, daughter now, right?
Got a couple of them. I got an eligible bachelor. He's 25. He's a nationally ranked speed shooter in a couple of different leagues. 22 caliber speed shooter.
Okay.
Michigan grad, making his dad proud, and he's a scientist. So he's living his best life at home, as many 25-year-old bona fide kids are. But he's doing his best. And then my 22-year-old is both my two biological kids, Matt, were 2-pound preemies. I don't know if you knew that.
Oh, no, I didn't know.
Yeah, my wife almost died in both situations. So she had something called HELPS, high enzyme low platelets. Some people call it preeclampsia, but it's actually more complicated than that. And so she came very close to death with both kids. And so we said, we're no longer going to have kids. And she said, oh, yeah, well, I'm not agreeing to that. So we adopted a third kid, and I'm glad we did. Beautiful 15-year-old who's living her best 10th grade life and doing all the 10th grade stuff, boyfriend, job. She's a very driven person. So, and she has the ADHD. She's the one who has the ADHD. Mm-hmm. But she's such a driven kid. And my other two kids wouldn't have done this, although they are self-starters. But my 15-year-old actually said, Dad, how much does the car cost? And I said, well, it depends. And she said, well, how much does this car cost? And so I gave her a dollar figure. She said, are you going to buy that for me, right? And I said, no. So our deal in our family, Matt, is that when you get of age, I give you one of two pathways. I'll either lease you a brand new car if you give me the down payment, and I'll pay for it. But at the end of that, you get nothing. You got to have a plan on how to get your next car. Mm-hmm. The other path is I'll buy you a great used car. You still have to give me the same down payment, but you won't have any payment. And at the end of you'll have the car. So I had one kid that did one thing, the other kid that did the other thing. And so my youngest, Gabby, she says, well, this is the car I want. And you're going to lease the car. And in the 36 months that you're paying for the car, I'm going to give the same dollar amount to myself through my work. That way, when my lease is up, I'll get an even better car. How's that work? I'm like, well, that's the one with ADHD. So I think there's probably two places where she's going to land. She'll either be the governor of the state of Michigan on her way to the White House, or she'll be running the most sophisticated cigarette Ponzi scheme in federal penitentiary that we've ever seen. So one of those two, I think, is going to be true for her. So.
Either way, she's going to make her mark on the world.
That's
right. Maybe leveraging some generative AI along the way. So you have a couple of things that I want to make sure that we highlight. And then I can let you back to the rest of your day. You're the founder of the Every Campus movement. You've got the Jubilee Conference. Can you talk about some of that stuff and maybe even feel free to kind of plug it a little bit here?
Yeah, for sure.
On what that looks like. And by the way, you mentioned your wife and her struggles during the pregnancies, but let's give her a couple of props here. Tell everybody about her.
She's amazing. Yeah, love of my life. Been married 28 years. I met her on her 19th birthday, so I consider myself God's gift to her. She would probably have a different interpretation of that. Yeah, I've been married 28 years and the 3 kids, and she's a project manager for a disaster restoration company, which, she loves and hates, depends on which day and what she's actually doing. So, and then the Every Campus Coalition is a data-driven coalition of 130 organizations in our industry. So there are about 130 organizations that do direct ministry with college students in the United States. And in 2017, I said, man, we should all just get together. There's a bigger story to that. And I had a couple of co-founders with me. So it wasn't as if I just went out and did this with my own idea. But I did start the process. And that coalition grew from 2 to 130 organizations. And it's a meaningful, deep partnership model. So we have organizations in the coalition that share employees, share costs, share social media platforms. All of the organizations share data. It all lives on a shared platform that we have access to. So it's a very meaningful coalition. I know a lot of times coalitions are, you lend your name to a cause, and this is a real data-driven coalition. And then the Jubilee Conference is a conference unlike I've ever seen. And I'm a conference guy because I've written 4 books and I speak at all kinds of conferences. And I've never seen a conference like this. So when I became the CEO of the CCO, which has taken me 3 years to say, part of the reason why I said yes is because our organization has this phenomenal jewel of a conference called the Jubilee Conference. Happens every February in downtown Pittsburgh, which I've discovered everybody wants to go to in America in the middle of February. They want to go to downtown Pittsburgh.
I tell my wife that every year.
I mean, it's a hot spot, which is why, we get the best rates at the hotels. And I call it an upside down conference because there's really nobody famous on the platform. The big gathering where we have thousands of people, working professionals, college students, we have people from all over the United States come to this. Nobody's really quite that famous on the platform. But then you go to the seminars. We have 72 seminars. So, wow, that's a lot of seminars. We have lines out the door for these seminars. So imagine if you're somebody in construction management, a student at Texas A&M, where you can get a degree in construction management. Instead of just, coming to some religious conference, you're going to come to a faith and work conference where you're going to get to go to a seminar. We're going to sit under the McGowan brothers, who own Storyland Studios, who own these companies, who redesigned Disneyland, who now are doing a $700 billion project in Dubai. You're going to be able to sit under their wisdom and their instruction to hear about faith and work. If you're an architect student, you're going to be able to sit under the instruction of David Greisel, who designed PNC Park and, another bulk park, iconic hotels across the United States. So I call it an upside down conference. It's for working professionals. You could go. I'd love to have you come, Matt. In fact, you'll get an invite from me. It's for students. It's really for anybody who wants to learn more about this meaning making that I'm talking about. So
great.
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks for asking.
No problem. What's one thing you want every viewer, or as many viewers as possible, or listeners of the audio version of the podcast, to walk away with that they maybe picked up from you?
Yeah. I would say the number one thing that I would say is that your best version of yourself is one where everything is integrated and not dichotomized. As so oftentimes we think about our professional life, our family life, our leisure is almost siloed. I've made a commitment over the course of my life that I'm just one same simple person. So you and I know each other through Vistage, which is a phenomenal opportunity for people in our seat to collaborate and build each other up and be the best CEOs that we can be. Well, I'm the same person when I go to church on Sunday. I have the same conversations that I'm having here with this podcast that I have with, people at church and people in my organization. So I would just say, the best version of yourself is an integrated version. And if there's one element that people oftentimes dichotomize or silo, it's their faith arena, right? So I would say that most people are predisposed to faith. Even atheists, we all pray. Never let an atheist tell you that we don't pray, because for 20 years I was an atheist and I prayed almost every single day. We pray in secret and we don't call it prayer. We call it something else. But so many people, particularly people who are raised in the church, atheists are actually more likely to integrate their faith with their life than Christians. People who go to church every Sunday, or maybe they're Christmas, Easter, church-going folk, they are oftentimes most at risk of dichotomizing their faith from the rest of life. We have our religious self, which is a Sunday Bible prayer self. And then we go to work on Monday as if that's totally a different realm
Mm-hmm.
And I think, boy, that's just a horrible way to live. It's duplicitous, it's dishonest. But I think worse than that, it's the barrier to keeping you from your very best self.
That's powerful stuff. And when you really net it out, what's the thing that you love most about a person, and the people you want to be around? It's that you want to know what you're getting.
Yeah, they're authentic
every time.
Yeah,
You're getting their authentic self.
Mhm.
I want to know that you're the same person in every setting.
That's right. That's right.
And
Which is why I'm surprised you haven't pulled out the
yeah, right. Yeah, I haven't.
some of your antics.
I haven't pulled that out ever on the podcast, but the one of the guests we have up and coming was one of the speakers whose session I actually used that in.
Wow.
So we're going to keep that a secret what it is, and we're going to let Corinne talk about that on her upcoming podcast with us. So
That's great.
So anything else you want to let us know?
Man, just love getting to know you, man. You're a unicorn. You're an amazing guy.
You too,
keep
man.
me on my toes.
Yeah, I appreciate the friendship and love that we're getting to know each other better.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks for doing this. This episode of the BLTnT